Deaf education, bringing sound into a world of silence. Rejected, denied, exiled, denounced, marginalized, dismissed from society. The history of ASL can be traced back to about 1761 when the first school for the deaf was founded in France. The language that came out of this small society is still being used in France today. A deaf teacher from this school came to the U.S. and helped institute the first public school for the deaf. His name was Laurent Clerc. His signs, mixed with the languages already used by the deaf in that community, resulted in a whole new language for the deaf. ASL, as it's called today, still shows traces of its French origin. The man that brought Laurent Clerc from France to help start the first deaf school in America was Thomas Gaudet. Gaudet became interested in deaf education due to his relationship with his 9-year-old neighbor, whom he taught words by writing them with a stick in the dirt. The girl's father sent Gaudet to Europe to learn about methods to teach the deaf. This is where he met Laurent Clerc. Clerc taught him sign language the French way. Together they returned to America, raised funds, instituted the first school for the deaf, and became its first 2 teachers. The school opened on April 15, 1817, with only 7 students. Within a year, that number had increased to 33. This showed the need for deaf education, since the pupils were not legally required to go to school back in that time, and most of them were usually put to work at their family's farm. A major problem faced by the school was the lack of a universal language. Students had already come up with their own rudimentary signs in order to communicate at home. This opened the door for a new language to be formed by mixing French Sign Language with the American student signs. Simply put, the school was not accepted by most of the Hearing Society. However, enrollment numbers rose and more schools for the deaf began to appear due to the increase in deaf teachers. In 1864, the National Deaf-Mute College, now known as Gaudet University, was established by Congress.
During this time after the first school was founded, many exceptional students were produced. The products of this new education wanted to lose the nickname dummy that was given to so many deaf people in those times. Laura Bridgman, a deaf-blind woman who was friends with novelist Charles Dickens, learned to write letters and was known as the Helen Keller of her day. Others, such as Oliver Caswell and Julia Brace, were known for their personality and ability to blend in their home and social lives. Laura Redden Searing, a poet and journalist under the pen name Howard Glendon, is known for her articles and poems about the Civil War. The town of Glendon, Minnesota, was named for her. A change occurred in the year 1880 when an important event in the history of deaf education took place. It was the Second International Congress on Education of the Deaf, also referred to as Conference of Milan. From September 6th through the 11th, 164 delegates from various countries deliberated over one question: what method of communication was best for teaching deaf students? The only supporter of teaching sign language in school was America, which had only 5 delegates at the meeting. Therefore, at the end of the 6th day, the conference declared that oral education was better than manual education, and the United States had to comply. The teaching of sign language was banned in schools due to the simple belief that if a student learned to sign, he would not want to learn to speak because it was too difficult.
During this period in the history of deaf education, more exceptional students were produced. Princess Alice of Battenberg was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria and mother-in-law of Queen Elizabeth II. Deaf from birth, she learned to lip read in English, French, Greek, and German. Later on, during World War II, she sheltered Jewish refugees and later founded a nursing order of nuns. Regina Olsen Hughes knew French, Portuguese, Italian, Latin, German, and Romanian. She worked as a botanical artist for many years and now has 2 species named after her. The 20 years after the increase in teachers showed a decline in these numbers due to retirement. In the 1960s, William Stokoe published Sign Language Structure, which claimed that sign language is much like any spoken language. At this point, signing became accepted in schools again. Today, many methods are used to teach deaf students. Many educators refer to the toolbox. This term refers to a method that uses anything that works. Oralist and manualist methods are still used. Another widely used method is the placement of deaf students in a classroom with a hearing teacher and hearing students. These students are given an interpreter, and the interpreter speaks all of the words from the mouth of the teacher and sometimes other students to the deaf pupil.
How important is an interpreter's role? An interpreter's role is very important. It is very important for the deaf students to be able to understand what's going on around them in the class, what the professor is saying, as well as what's happening on a social level, what's happening on a collegiate level, and really just for them to be able to come to be equal with their peers. And the only way they'd be able to do this is if they could communicate and understand what's going on.
Do you find any prejudices in the classroom towards your students?
These prejudices have probably been overcome. Not that everything's gone away, and I think that we're heading in the right direction. And for the most part, students are very accepting and very willing to help, which is very nice to see. We have a lot of students who volunteer to become note takers because the deaf students can't watch their interpreter and focus on what's being said by their professor at the same time of taking notes. So these students volunteer for the semester in order to take notes for these individuals and who can't do both. I think that it's really great that we're at this point in terms of acceptance.
What difficulties have you faced while translating?
There are a number of difficulties that an interpreter faces, but I think the biggest difficulty that an interpreter faces would be making sure that they have an accurate translation of the language. There are many things said in English that really don't translate into sign language. There's many words, there's many concepts, and so it's really up to the interpreter at that point to totally translate the information in a way that the deaf student will be able to understand as best as possible with their understanding, to really have the language be the equivalent of the source language that it's coming from. Aside from other things that could just make it difficulty, if you have a speaker that's speaking way too fast, if you have a speaker that speaks way too slow, if you have jokes being told that don't really translate into sign language because it's funny in English, but then in sign language it's really not so funny. If you have more than one person talking, students maybe talking over one another or professors talking over one another, it's really your job to be able to convey all the information and to be the deaf person's eyes and ears. And so one person has to then translate what 3 or 4 people are saying at one time, and that can be a very difficult thing too. But I do think that the biggest difficulty would be to make sure that whatever you do, at the end of the day, the source information has to be translated accurately in the target language that you are signing for the deaf person to understand.
Do you think any improvements can be made to the deaf education system?
I definitely think improvements can be made. Improvements can be made in everything. Nobody's perfect. So there are many improvements that can be made. One improvement I think that can definitely be attempted to make, like I said, would be the standardized testing and maybe a different way or an alternative way that the deaf can take the test versus the way the hearing students take the test. Because even though it is the same test, the way they understand the tests, 2 different groups of people are different. English can understand something coming off of a page in 1 dimension, however a deaf person kind of needs 3 dimension. So I think maybe if we tried to look in that direction and try to move forward in that direction and find something, an alternative way, I think that would be very helpful and very beneficial to the deaf.
History would not be the same without deaf education. The deaf community has been enlightened as to the knowledge of the hearing world through this innovation. The concept of equality has been fulfilled through this new approach. Thanks to pioneers such as Gaudet, Clerk, and other deaf educators from their time through ours, those who were in a world of silence were finally brought into a world of sound.